coming up.
If you could change one thing that would inhibit misinformation, disinformation, you've talked a lot about social media. If you were responsible in this area for the Canadian government, what would you do first thing tomorrow?
I met with the Canadian-Ukrainian Congress yesterday. They advocated for bans.
It's recklessness from a government-verified account. Now, on the platform X.
One of the things that struck me was the way that different platforms, you looked in particular at X and at Facebook, dealt with disinformation related to the election. Could you sort of just walk us through the issue where 30% of the posts were not treated, consistently by the platforms, and why that was?
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
I'd like to welcome our witnesses. First, we have Samantha Bradshaw, who's an assistant professor, new technology and security. She's here by video conference, and from the Toronto Metropolitan University, Kareem Bardizi, who is the executive director.
No, Professor Bradshaw, you're currently, it sounds like a tenure-track professor in the U.S., is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, and this isn't bad or good or anything, I'm just wondering, have you lived in Canada or just stayed here during an election campaign or anything like that?
I have. Even though I live and work in the U.S., I'm actually Canadian, so. Okay,
perfect. Well, then that's good. So you'll be up to date, I'm sure, on a lot of Canadian political happenings. If you could name each of you, you all have your area of expertise, and sometimes we get very nuanced area of expertise, but I always like to ask this question. If you could change one thing that would inhibit misinformation, disinformation, you've talked a lot about social media, if you were responsible in this area for the Canadian government, what would you do first thing tomorrow? First, Professor Bradshaw.
Sure. I think I would be working around issues that have more to do with platform transparency. And I say this because I think, even especially with the Canadian context, we actually don't have a very good empirical understanding of how the activities that we see state actors engage in translate to changes in behavior, and particularly voting behavior. I think there are some real measurable consequences of these kinds of campaigns when they, for example, attack activists or female journalists, because there's clear kind of political suppression happening with very measurable consequences that appear in the literature. But getting somebody to change their mind or to alter their voting behavior, these kinds of things are very ingrained and embedded in our identities, and being able to actually get access to better data to study social media's immediate effect on those kinds of attitudinal changes over time, I think is really, really important to enhance a lot of the concerns raised by the field. We're starting to develop more empirics and evidence around this, but we need better access to data. And so that's where I would really start if I wanted to see changes. I unfortunately don't think that there is a silver bullet solution to mis and disinformation. There isn't something that we can immediately do to make this problem kind of go away, because it's kind of something that's really at the conflux of human behavior and the real technical design of platforms that might incentivize certain kinds of information to go viral over others, which again is also socially shaped by the people who are interacting with it. And so it's something that will need a lot more long-term attention to. So I think starting with the empirics and getting a better grounding and understanding of the causal mechanisms will be really, really important.
Sounds like we're looking at a 10 to 20 year project here based on the way you said it. And Mr. Bardizi, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I definitely endorse every single thing that Professor Bradshaw said, and to create that fact base for policymakers is really important. I will maybe answer with two quick points. One, a longer term project, but to have an olive system, education system response that brings in the media companies and those who are collectively responsible for creating a shared space for debate and factual presentation. And that, I believe, is a shared actually responsibility between educators and the media sector. And the second, I'll come back to, I think, the passage of the Online Harms Act, Bill C-63, would have a positive effect on some of these phenomena.
You know, one thing that I'm struck by as a parliamentarian, and I came in partway through this study, but you talk about deepfakes, and I have my idea of what that is. One of the things that really gives me concern is just how easy it is to create such content, and secondarily, how easy it is to disseminate such content. Given those two factors, are we really in a situation where, rather than, as opposed to prevention, we're really looking at management?
I think yes, but I also think that in the context of, mis and disinformation and coordinated efforts to manipulate election processes, there's a much longer kill chain for, the technical kind of platform speak around an information operation. In order to get the deep fake on the platform and going viral, you have to be able to create a fake account. And in order to create the fake account, you have to deceive a lot of the internal systems within these platforms. And so I think even though there is an easier ability to kind of create and disseminate deep fake related content, if we're talking about it in the context of an information operation, we still need to consider the broader life cycle that these operations have to go through. And a lot of the mitigation measures have nothing really to do with the AI side of things. It still relies much more on, the old school kind of IP detection and all of the tricks that platforms play to figure out if this is a real person or a fake account.
I met with the Canadian-Ukrainian Congress yesterday. They advocated for bans on Russian state-led media on the internet. Canada has banned certain media. It's also taken measures to look at other social media platforms, WeChat and TikTok and others like that. So I'm wondering if bans are effective. And if you can maybe talk a little bit about that and getting into maybe I'll actually switch to Mr. Bardisi and maybe engage in the conversation as well. Maybe you can maybe shed some light on that. And why are these methods working?
Well, banning on broadcast channels is a bit easier than banning internet sites or online content. That's why we think at the dais the Online Harms Act, which doesn't look at so much specific platforms, but looks at this specific behavior and content, is the way to go. Coupled with some of that algorithmic transparency, coupled with some of that availability to have data that Professor Bradshaw mentioned. I'll also, I guess, bring a piece that we haven't really talked about yet, which this entire conversation exists in a context of trust or mistrust. And where there is a trusted messenger, that is where the misinfo or disinfo is more likely to land. And where there's a context of mistrust, then a messenger can fill that vacuum and generate trust. I think that's the main concern with some of these propaganda outfits. It's not that people around this table don't see them as propaganda. It's more that there are people who are perhaps have lower trust in some of the mainstream media institutions or some of the institutions of society more generally. In Canada, the Reuters Digital News Survey shows that trust in mainstream media and news overall has fallen 20 points over the last few years, 20 percentage points. So it's in that context that some of these actors can weaponize some of those platforms or associate themselves with ideas that are harmful to Canada. It's very difficult, both legislatively and in other ways, to actually ban platforms or sites in Canada. Countries have tried to do this, including some Western countries, and some in the global South with very large populations, and we've seen those bans. TikTok is banned in India. There was an attempt to ban X in Brazil. That itself is difficult enough to ban at the individual outlet level is very operationally difficult and may not be meeting the interests of what we're trying to pursue here.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Baines.
Mr. Bardesi, I do know you from your previous life, and I'm wondering, without putting you on the spot, if you're comfortable talking about your political experience in campaigns at all.
Sure. Yeah, I'm here as an expert witness, but I do have that background, both as a political staffer and more recently as a candidate in the provincial election 2022. And I'll say that I observed the in a very acute way, and perhaps this is familiar to other members, the third part of my remarks about the Canadian media ecosystem more generally. My campaign, like a lot of maybe local campaigns, just didn't get any local coverage.
I actually have more specificity, although I'm sure your local campaign was exhilarating. I want to go back to the Kathleen Wynne election. And from the outside looking in, the emergence of Ontario Proud under Jeff Ballingall, who we know to be a conservative staffer, somebody who has, created Canada Proud, is an owner in the post-millennial, and has been at the center of particular egregious examples of misinformation and disinformation. And I know that there was a fervor, second only to what I would see from this recent kind of iteration of the Trudeau culture that has been created on the far right. Can you speak to, from your experience, in whatever way you think appropriate to this discussion, ways in which you may have watched Ontario Proud use Facebook and other, although I think it was primarily Facebook, avenues to spread misinformation, disinformation, and I would say malinformation, if I could.
Yeah. So I was the Director of Policy and the Deputy Principal Secretary to the Premier of Ontario from 2011 to 2016. So I was there for the Premier Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, and I was the platform lead on the 2014 campaign. And at that time, frankly, these issues were not as pronounced. There was a media ecosystem there that was out there. There was online campaigning. People appeared to be getting information from a variety of sources, and mistrust and the toxic authoritarian populism that started to emerge in North America was not as apparent then. I will say, and this was primarily after I left the Premier's office, but I know that definitely Premier Wynne faced a certain amount of personally directed hate, as did caucus members, as did, in fact, people from a variety of political and partisan persuasions as elected officials. While I wasn't involved in the 28 campaign with some of the events that you described, we actually did do a study in 2019 as part of the Facebook ad transparency work that we were trying to bring. We allied with a researcher that was bringing disclosure on who was being targeted with Facebook ads, and that, along with a number that was called Who Targets Me, that's still a project that's underway with our collaborators over in the UK and Ireland. And so we did a study at that time, not focused on the provincial election, but then which prompted that and other efforts prompted pretty good Facebook political ad transparency registry that was created. And indeed, the entity that you described and a number of others with either generic names or names that weren't quite reflective of what they were actually promoting were some of the main buyers of online ads on Facebook in the 29 campaign. And I'll just leave it with the names of the organizations would not tell you with much specificity what they were actually about.
Well, I do know that there's a National Observer story that I think was in 2022 that linked phone numbers with people such as Angelo Isidoro, who Corporate Filings identified as a writer for the Post-Millennial, who made headlines when he resigned from Vancouver's NPA party after allegedly flashing a hand gesture associated with white extremism. I would say likely a Nazi salute. And he has, of course, through these findings, direct connections with Ballingal's company, Mobilized Media Group. And so if you could just talk a little bit about the way in which there is I would put it, threat of third-party advertisers, social media, and the ecosystem of misinformation and disinformation as it relates to electoral politics, particularly given the consideration that we've just seen an election in BC. We have them in the prairies. It's going to be coming to us federally. If you could just comment on that. I have about 45 seconds left.
Sure. I'll say this. There are a number of news outlets or outlets that appear to be news outlets that are primed and designed to appeal to a younger demographic. The Buffalo News was mentioned in the Huck Commission's initial report. There are a number of outlets that, and with the Meta, Facebook, and Instagram news ban, there are new ones that are popping up. SixBuzz is a popular one amongst my students in the Greater Toronto area. So I'll observe that there are a number of sites that don't have the kind of editorial controls that you would expect, that masquerade or that appear to be news sites or that have an agenda that are reaching larger audiences.
So I'd like to refer to an ABC News article dated October 18, 2023. It says, U.S. says initial independent review shows no evidence of bomb strike on Gaza hospital. I want to read the first paragraph of this article. A day after the Hamas-led Gaza Health Ministry claimed Israel had attacked the Al-Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza City, saying some 500 Palestinians had been killed, Israeli and U.S. officials, explosive experts, and President Joe Biden said Wednesday, and available evidence shows the destruction was caused instead by a failed Palestinian terrorist rocket launch. I'm going to end the quote from that story there, but I would then like to refer to a tweet from 10/7/2023, and it's by Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, posted on X, and it says, quote, bombing a hospital is an unthinkable act, and there's no doubt that doing so is absolutely illegal. Now, that was viewed 2.7 million times, and I want to draw to your attention the context that existed at the time, and that goes back to this ABC article's opening graph that talks about that initial claim. And that initial claim was that Israel had perpetrated an attack on a civilian site, killing 500 civilians, innocents, in that war. And that was reported by mainstream news outlets across the West, including here in Canada, and many, if not all, issued some form of correction. But the tweet that I read to you from Canada's foreign minister, I just read that and wrote it down in the last 5 minutes. So that tweet is still up, viewed 2.7 million times. How harmful is this? It's frankly, it's recklessness from a government-verified account. Now, on the platform X, there's different types of verifications, and one of them is from a government official or an elected official. This has the gray check mark. Talk about the disruption that foreign or hostile state actors they seek to create. And it's not necessarily to favor one political ideology or another. And I think, Professor Bradshaw, you talked about during a very contentious time in 2020 in the U.S., BLM riots, and the same hostile states were sponsoring or fomenting both supporters of BLM, but also supporters of Blue Lives Matter. So trying to create discord between two groups in a very tense situation, a tense time. So this example here, do you believe that this type of failure to act after a hot take, which can happen on social media, do you believe that it enables hostile foreign states to create the kind of division that, frankly, we've seen in Canada in the face of this this ongoing war in the Middle East? I'll start with you, Professor Bradshaw.
Yeah, so I don't remember the fact check story or anything like that. So I'm going to focus my response mainly on the role that I think influencers can play in the dissemination of mis and disinformation when we're looking at things like COVID misinformation, for example. It's really a small number of people who tend to generate the most engagement around like the conspiracy theories, and thinking about the role of people who have large audiences on social media. There's almost a greater incentive or a greater reason to, with great power comes great responsibility, kind of take more steps to ensure that fair and accurate and good information is going out to audiences. But platforms in particular have not traditionally taken that path. There have been a lot of, whistleblower documents that have shown specific kind of whitelists of accounts from people who are influencers who have large followings and can kind of get past a lot of the moderation systems because it generates engagement. And so for me, I think the problem is really there. And we should not be so worried about a Russian Twitter account that's not generating as much engagement and not reaching like mainstream public attention. But we should also be thinking more broadly about the role of influencers. And I also think that's why we see a lot of Russian information operations pivoting to hiring and co-opting local voices and people who already have audiences. If we're thinking about policy responses too, like generating that kind of trust and building a culture for influencers to do some defending of democracy could be a potential like positive route. But you also don't want to be paying them and do that kind of stuff. But you know what I mean.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, Mr. Bardisi, we didn't have time to go to you. Mr. Housefather.
Professor Bradshaw, I read your paper about the 2020 election that you co-wrote with some others. And one of the things that struck me was the way that different platforms, you looked in particular at X and at Facebook, dealt with disinformation related to the election. Could you sort of just walk us through the issue where 30% of the posts were not treated, consistently by the platforms, and why that was?
Yeah, so this was a paper that used a really interesting data set of misinformation narratives that we had identified and reported to the platforms, and then we assessed whether or not they took action or did not take action against the content that was reported to them, and sort of checked by researchers to see, is this a misinformation narrative or not? And one of the things that explained the differences, some of them were really simple, technical fixes. For example, if we had reported a narrative, things that were on a certain date, things that were published before weren't necessarily backdated with a label, but things going forward were. We also noticed differences across the different kinds of media. And if things were screen grabbed or cut or edited slightly, the automated detection tools didn't always do a great job at identifying similar kind of misinformation narratives, because you have to remember a lot of this kind of content takedown is done automatically by automated systems. And so there was a couple of problems there. But, for the most part, we saw about 70% of the content being enforced, and a lot of the decisions to not enforce were relatively arbitrary based on these kind of small, technical problems or problems with the automated systems that I think could easily be fixed.
Well, the allegation that there were pre-filled ballots, and when you had a picture of the pre-filled ballot, you would then have the content noted as being misinformation, but you wouldn't necessarily if they put up a video saying this. Is that kind of correct? Yeah,
it really depended on the particular narratives that we were looking at. I don't remember if that was an exact example, but that is kind of a good characterization of like some of the differences we were seeing.
They put together the election integrity, type of approach from the different social media companies in 2020. When we're looking at the upcoming Canadian election, what lessons should we learn that the Americans did right in 2020, or that the social media companies did well as they applied it to the 2020 election, and what did they do wrong?
Yeah. So in terms of really great lessons, I think a lot of the partnerships with academic institutions was a real success. Like it led us to be able to not only detect and brief the public real time on misinformation narratives that were occurring, but allowed us to do really interesting and novel research on the back end to sort of audit platform content moderation, something that's really, really difficult to do. In terms of things that could be done better, I think there was so much public and far right outlash against those kinds of initiatives, and universities didn't do well at necessarily protecting the researchers and the groups who were doing this really important work. And I don't think the platforms really did a lot to kind of protect those partnerships, and they're taking a step back from doing those kinds of collaborations now. And so I think that was a real harm, and something that we could protect and create a more positive multi-stakeholder culture around.
Do you have any time, Mr. Chair? 3 seconds. Oh. I'll pass that on to my Bloc and NDP colleague if one of them wants to take it. Thanks.
I actually may take that time.
Okay,
at the end,
fine.
So,
then I'll pass it on to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Housefather.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bradshaw, you had probably listened into my exchange there. I know that you're Canadian, so you have context to this. My friend, Mr. Villamere, talked about kind of cognitive warfare. Steve Bannon, in fact, a chief far-right extremist strategist with connections to Canada's far-right extremist movement, talked about cognitive warfare. In essence, flooding the zone with a word that I can't say because it's unparliamentary. Could you comment on the ecosystem of third-party political actors, fake news, quite literally these fake online platforms that pop up? You can probably list, there's probably a dozen of them that I can think of off of 10. And then the online platforms that actually look like news. You talked about the Buffalo News, there's the Western Standard, there's a whole bunch of these far-right extreme outlets. How do average people sift through all of that stuff in an electoral cycle in order to make informed decisions based on the facts?
Yeah, certainly. So first, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the disinformation for hire kind of groups and how there is an industry kind of backing a lot of disinformation campaigns, which reminds us that we should not only focus on political and cognitive warfare, but recognize that a lot of these actors are incentivized. So not just platforms, but the creators of disinformation are incentivized to do so because they can generate advertising revenue or business deals with governments. And so thinking about policy responses could also think about raising the costs to engage in these kinds of activities by making them less profitable, taking, the typical kind of scam and fraud approaches and applying it to disinformation and these groups that try to generate advertising revenue by creating fake news stories and getting people to visit websites that show them ads. Like this is all kind of part of the broader ecosystem of challenges. And so when it comes to what citizens should do to navigate this complicated environment, I do think that we don't always give citizens enough credit for the diversity of media that they already consume. We don't just get our news from social media. It does play an increasingly important role, but so do our what we read in newspapers, what we watch on TV, who our social circles are, and who's kind of immediately around us in our community. All of these things play really important roles in terms of shaping our political knowledge and then therefore our behaviors. And so when we're thinking about solutions, like we can focus and home in on the social media angle, but we can also think about building more robust social institutions to empower people through different other kinds of media to have that diverse knowledge and to be able to generate their own kind of political knowledge and opinions.
Thank you. I definitely ran out of time. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Chair. I know you were generous.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, Ms. Bradshaw. En avant de poser ma question.
Before I ask my question, apologies, Mr. Bardizzi, you speak French very well.
I do have a question. None of this has been touched today, but we have heard from prior witnesses about the impact that artificial intelligence is going to have on the propagation of disinformation and misinformation. So I'm going to give you both an opportunity in a minute or less to share your thoughts with the committee on that. And I'll start with you, Mr. Bardizzi, if you don't mind.
Sure. So AI, Kevin Kelly was this internet kind of guru back in the day, says the internet is fundamentally a giant copying machine. And AI has the ability to create, copies of things at incredible speed and at incredibly low cost and incredible volume. I'm specifically concerned, actually, with AI-generated content on audio versus visual content. I think there's some evidence that audio content is harder to discern as being a deepfake. So that's one thing to be aware of, that as we prepare people around this issue, that we have a specific kind of line of inquiry about audio-related deep fake content. I also, though, commend to this group, Bruce Shiner, Harvard Kennedy School researcher, has this great little article, 16 ways that AI can be kind of useful or interesting for democracy. It's not all bad. There may be some specific uses around the edges of AI that could help us and help you do your jobs.
Okay.
But definitely area of concern.
Thank you. Ms. Bradshaw.
Yeah, +1 to everything Professor Bardizzi has said. For me, I think the greatest challenge with AI is the way that we talk about it in the public and in the media, because coming back to the idea of trust, when we're constantly telling people that they can't trust anything they see, read, or hear, we're not creating resilient citizens who are able to then effectively participate in society. And so I think being able to create digital literacy programs that generate, that don't build too much kind of like just overt skepticism, and that kind of like need to not trust anything that we read, see, or hear anymore, I think is really, really important going forward, because we do need some level of trust. So I'll end there.
Yeah. Interesting, because one of the things we have heard is exactly what you've talked about: critical thinking, digital literacy, and Finland has been used as the model for education in grade school. And I suspect, and I can't preclude any conclusions or recommendations of this committee, but that may be a big part of what we provide in terms of a recommendation going forward. So.